Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We finally got our first Formula One car of 2021, the McLaren MCL35M, as it's been rebranded. As we know, now powered by Mercedes, no longer Renault. And that's had some significant impacts that we'll talk about in a moment. I know lots of you might be thinking, well, hang on, aren't the cars just the same as last year? Haven't we frozen things like chassis and other technologies that just carry over, which means surely that everyone's just unveiling a car that simply has a new paint job? Well, some of those things are correct, but we are not going to be seeing cars which are identical to the ones that finished last season, perhaps none more so than this McLaren because of that engine change or that power unit change to a Mercedes. I'm going to talk about the knock-on effects of that, what they've had to do to adapt the car and the chassis to take that new power unit from Mercedes. We're going to talk about some of the aero changes which will become very obviously clear when you see the top-down view as well, and what else we might be able to learn about the car. So let's get into it. First of all then, this car does have the same chassis. That is one of the regulations that was brought in last year. Teams must carry over their chassis from 2020 to 2021. It's brought in the wake of the global pandemic and the financial impact that has had to save money, to stop people designing one of the most expensive bits of the car, the chassis. Teams will carry one over from last year to this year. Not unusual, it's been done before. Renault did it last year, not because they were forced to through regulation, but just because it was a cost-saving measure. Other teams have done it as well. But in this instant, it's been done as a cost-saving measure. However, in McLaren's case, because they're changing from a Renault power unit to a Mercedes power unit, it has had an impact on that. You cannot just take a Renault power unit with all the ancillaries and packaging that goes along with that and swap it out for a Mercedes one and expect everything still to work and to fit. One of the biggest differences between the two power units is that the Renault has this combined compressor and turbine on their turbo. Both halves of the turbo are essentially packaged together. They sat on the back of the engine, somewhere right back here, right behind the engine. With the Mercedes, we've known this for some time, Mercedes split the two halves of their turbo. Half of it sits on the back, the other half sits on the front of the engine, between the engine and the chassis. Now, you can immediately see there that if there's a lump, if there's a half of a turbo sat on the front of the engine, which would normally be butted up almost right against the back of that chassis, they bolt onto each other. It's called a stressed member. The engine is part of the chassis. It takes all the twisting, torsional loads as the car goes around a racetrack. It's stressed, and therefore it butts hard up against the back of that chassis. Now though, on the Mercedes, it has the turbo that has to be accommodated, or at least half the turbo, at the front of that engine. That will mean some modifications to the chassis that was running last year with a Renault in the back. Well, how do they do that? Well, McLaren have had to spend their development tokens. This is something that all teams have a limited number of to be able to add some development to their car between seasons. McLaren, instead of being able to spend those on outright performance areas, have had to spend those tokens on adapting the chassis to enable that new Mercedes power unit to fit in. It's not just, of course, that split turbo that's now one of the issues they've had to overcome. That has a knock-on effect to things like the cooling systems, where the intercooler might sit, how it needs to be packaged around that power unit. And therefore, of course, what happens in things like the radiators, in the side pods, what happens to the cooling system, the wiring network will all be brand new. The electrical boxes that run the power unit will also have some variation and some differences to what went before. So all of the packaging has to now be repackaged to fit this Mercedes power unit under what was an existing aerodynamic package. You can't just take one out and put it into the old system. So they've had to make some changes. So they've had to spend those development tokens on the chassis, on adapting it, on accommodating this new power unit. Now, there is a chance that that will have compromised them in some way, because other teams will have been able to spend their development tokens on outright performance development. That's a compromise that McLaren have had to take on the chin, knowing that, or hoping at least that, the Mercedes power unit will bring them some performance that might override any deficit they may have otherwise lost through that system. They're hoping the Mercedes will bring them more power, more drivability, more usability, more performance ultimately than they had with their Renault power unit. So that's essentially what's happening in the back of here, repackaging all of that. You will also notice slightly different sculpting around the bodywork, around the side pods, much more in line with other Mercedes powered teams, a bit like the Williams we saw last year, a bit like Mercedes themselves, sculpting differently to accommodate the different cooling packages that have to now go with that Mercedes power unit. Now, if we look at the car from the top, you'll see some of the more aerodynamic based changes that all teams are now facing. Now, looking top down, you really get a very clear view of what the regulations have done to the rear of the floor, just ahead of the rear tyres of the car. This area here, very clearly slimmed down. We've had to take a diagonal profile on the back of the floor, running in, all the way from the front, running in towards the rear of the tyre, or the front of the rear tyres there. A much narrower section. And not only that, all of those flick ups and slots and flaps that we became so used to, longitudinal slats, little what they call tyre squirt slots in front of the rear tyres, really crucial, small but crucial details that were there to enable the sealing of the diffuser underneath the car, creating spiral vortices that powerfully run along the edge of the floor, sealing in the low pressure that runs underneath the car, stopping that pressure differential equalising between under the floor and outside of the floor, which would then diminish the power of the diffuser. So we've lost all of that. Teams are now going to have to find new ways to replicate what they had before. A lot of that work's going to have to now be done further upstream. Things like the deflectors, the barge boards, little flick ups and flaps and tiny little vortex generators around that area that might help to recapture some of that sealing effect all the way down towards the back that was previously lost because of the regulation change. That's what every team's going to be working on. This whole area here is going to be a massive area of development, particularly over the early part of the season. Probably not for the whole season because, of course, development on the 2021 cars is going to be limited to some extent because we've got this looming change in 2022 where everything changes. It's going to be a race in the early part of the season to get the most performance out before you then start to switch your resource fully over to the 2022 car and leave what you've got now to see out the rest of the season. There are also changes around the rear of the brake ducts. We can't see them on this view necessarily, but they will also have a reasonable impact on the downforce that's created at the rear end of the car, particularly around that diffuser. Now, on McLaren's official release photos that we've got here, they have very deliberately blocked out the back of the diffuser here, another area of lots of development work, because more aerodynamic changes enforced on the teams this year mean that the little strakes that hang down from the underside of the diffuser are now shorter than they were before, and the effect of that is that they become far less powerful than they were previously. So teams are going to be looking for ways, tiny details, to recapture some of that lost performance. We heard James Key talking about they were hoping they might get the cars back to some kind of similar level of performance just through development from where we left off last year, even though the regulations have probably trimmed off something like 10% of the car's overall downforce, just in regulation terms. The teams now set about working on the new areas that they can exploit to try and find some of that back, to bring it back and increase the performance of the car. It's what engineers are very, very good at in the world of Formula One. Lots of this work that I talked about around the barge board area won't be seen on these released images of the car. This was very much a show car, very much a press release car and a launch car. It won't be the spec that we see when we get to Bahrain for what will be some very limited number of days of testing. Just 3 days this time around, which for McLaren could be even a bigger hit than normal. They've got in that 3 days to not only understand the working relationship with their new partners at Mercedes, despite having worked with them many years ago. It's a whole new relationship that has to be formed, but also the technical systems, literally the physics of getting that engine in and out. How quickly can it be done? How long does it take if they have a problem and have to change it on a race weekend? Those are things you would normally be trying over testing, but also the onboard systems that the engineers have to work with. The drivers can operate from their steering wheel switches as well. All new technology, all new systems that have to be learnt in a very short period of time. Just a day and a half for each driver. That's almost nothing. And if there are problems, their relationship and the smoothness of that operation could take a hit, could be compromised, as opposed to many other teams who have continuation in those departments between last season and this season. Another area of repackaging that will have affected the chassis almost certainly is the energy store, the battery for the hybrid power unit, which sits underneath the fuel cell, just behind the driver in the base of the floor. Again, it will just be a slightly different shape or size It will have different ancillaries and pipework or wiring rather running off that. Cooling systems for it will be slightly different. It won't just fit into the old gap that the Renault one left. So they will have to have made modifications, again using those development tokens that they're allowed as opposed to using them for outright performance gains. So not a huge amount to be learnt on the specifics of this car. There are detailed changes to things like mirrors, again to try and generate some vortices around this area that will continue, because of course we've got new airflow now running over reprofiled bodywork down towards this new rear end of the car. The mirrors can play a significant role in how we generate vortices at this point, just to enable the spiraling airflow to pick up energy and remain attached to the contours of this new bodywork as it flows down towards the rear. You can even see just about on this photo how the profile of the side pod, as it bulges out over some of the cooling elements of the car, the radiators, filters down into this now really big deep undercut towards the rear of the floor, slimmed in. We heard Lando Norris say it's slimmed in with the Mercedes power unit over and above what they had with Renault, which gives you an even bigger channel to feed air into inside the back of the floor, coming out above the top of the diffuser to help aid the power, the draw that pulls air through that diffuser, and that ultimately will result in more downforce. So little details like changes to mirrors can have a more significant effect much further downstream. The airbox looks like it's got some differences as well, perhaps also just to accommodate that new Mercedes power unit, much more in line with other Mercedes power unit users, as you'd probably expect. Not a huge amount more to learn from this very early initial launch photo and launch press release that we've got this evening, but also some really interesting details around what McLaren will have had to accommodate to make this work. The big questions are going to be, how much of a compromise in terms of performance have they had to take in taking and accommodating this Mercedes power unit, and offset that with how much performance will the Mercedes power unit bring over and above the Renault? That's one of the big questions we're going to see, a direct comparison between a Mercedes power unit and a Renault power unit in essentially the same car for the first time. Going to be interesting times, great new driver pairing, a really exciting lineup in Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris. I think the team's on a really positive, strong trajectory like this, heading back towards some success. 2022, a really big opportunity for them, but I don't think we should be writing McLaren off in 2021, despite the compromises that I've talked about. I think the mindset of the team, the culture of the team, the environment that team now has, everything's in place, the right people are in place, hopefully the car's in place for some really strong positive results this year.